The heavy oak doors of Willowbrook Plantation creaked open, revealing a dimly lit parlor, thick with the scent of damp wood and fading grandeur. Jeremiah Aldrich stood stiffly at the altar, his eyes hollow, his face pale beneath the flickering candlelight. Across from him, Celeste the enslaved cook, a woman whose life had been bound to this land and its cruel master waited silently, her expression unreadable. The room was filled with neighbors and acquaintances, their whispers barely masking the shock and disbelief that rippled through the gathered crowd. This was no ordinary wedding. It was a spectacle of humiliation, a grotesque wager made in shadows, and a binding contract that would unravel lives in ways no one could have foreseen. The marriage was not born of love or faith, but of a deadly bet, a wager that would become a weapon of revenge, a slow-burning poison far more devastating than any bullet or blade. In the months that followed, 13 mysterious deaths would haunt the region, each one a dark echo of the betrayal that had taken root in that very room. The whispers grew louder, rumors of conspiracies, so intricate and cruel that even the most hardened souls in the antebellum South recoiled in horror. What would you do if your fate was sealed not by your own choices, but by a bet and a marriage that stripped you of every shred of dignity? Would you fight, or would you succumb to the slow, suffocating grip of vengeance? Tonight, we unravel the story of Jeremiah Aldrich and Celeste, a tale of ambition, betrayal, and a justice so cold and calculated it would shake the foundations of a society built on blood and silence. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear is not just history. It's a dark mirror reflecting the depths of human cruelty and the unyielding power of retribution. The year was 1854, and the sultry air of Louisiana hung heavy with the scent of magnolia and decay. The antebellum South was a land of stark contrasts, where the genteel elegance of sprawling plantations masked a brutal, unforgiving reality. Willowbrook Plantation, like many others along the Mississippi River, stood as a monument to wealth and power, its white columns gleaming in the relentless sun, its manicured gardens a testament to the pride of its owner. But beneath this polished surface lay a world of suffering, a shadow realm where human lives were bought, sold, and broken with cold indifference. In the grand parlors and ballrooms, the planter elite gathered to sip mint juleps and discuss politics, their conversations laced with the language of honor and tradition. They wore their wealth like armor, shielding themselves from the horrors that sustained their lifestyle. Yet just beyond the manicured lawns, the true cost of this prosperity was painfully clear. Enslaved men and women toiled from dawn until dusk in the fields, their bodies bent and bruised, their spirits shackled by a system that saw them as nothing more than property. The illegal slave trade, though officially banned, thrived in the shadows. Smugglers and traders operated with ruthless efficiency, exploiting loopholes and corrupt officials to keep the flow of human cargo alive. This underworld was a dark mirror to the genteel society, above a place where greed and cruelty knew no bounds, and where the lives of the enslaved were reduced to mere commodities. It was here, in this murky intersection of wealth and violence, that Jeremiah Aldrich carved out his empire. The social order was rigid and unforgiving. Racial hierarchies dictated every interaction, every law, every whispered rumor. The idea of a white plantation owner marrying an enslaved woman was not just scandalous, it was unthinkable. Such a union would shatter the carefully constructed illusions of superiority and control that the South's elite clung to. It threatened to upend the very foundations of a society built on racial division and oppression. Yet it was precisely this taboo that would become the fulcrum of a devastating revenge. The forced marriage between Aldrich and Celeste was not merely a personal humiliation. It was a calculated act designed to expose the fragility of power and the corrosive nature of betrayal. In a world where appearances were everything, this union was a public unraveling, a slow, deliberate dismantling of a man's carefully crafted identity. As the sun set over the Mississippi, casting long shadows across the plantation, the stage was set for a story that would haunt the South for years to come, a story of ambition, cruelty, and a vengeance that would not be denied. The genteel facade was cracking, and beneath it, the dark heart of the antebellum South beat with a relentless, unforgiving rhythm. Jeremiah Aldrich was not born into privilege or power. The son of a failed tobacco farmer in the rugged hills of Kentucky, his early years were marked by hardship and disappointment. His family's land was barren, their debts mounting, and the promise of prosperity seemed forever out of reach. But Jeremiah carried within him a fierce ambition, a hunger that would not be sated by the modest life his father had known. At the age of 20, he left Kentucky behind, setting his sights on the bustling port city of New Orleans, a place where fortunes were made and lost in the blink of an eye, and where the shadows of the slave stretched long and dark. New Orleans in the late 1830s was a city of contradictions. Its streets teemed with wealth and vice, opportunity and danger. For a man like Aldrich, it was the perfect place to reinvent himself. He quickly learned that the established planter aristocracy looked down on men like him, outsiders with no pedigree, no family name to open doors. But where they saw stigma, Aldrich saw opportunity. The illegal slave trade, though officially outlawed, was still thriving beneath the surface, and it was a business few of the old Creole families dared to touch openly. Here, Aldrich found his calling. He forged alliances with men whose desperation matched his own ruthless ambition. Marcus Deveau, the youngest son of a declining sugar baron, was drowning in debt and eager to save his family's crumbling plantation. Samuel Rochelle, a former ship captain who had lost everything to yellow fever and bad investments, possessed invaluable knowledge of the clandestine routes that smuggled enslaved people from the Caribbean and Cuba. Together, they formed the Delta Trading Company, a shadowy enterprise that specialized in recovery services, a euphemism for kidnapping, smuggling, and re-enslaving human beings. Aldrich's moral decay was swift and absolute. He cared nothing for the lives he destroyed, viewing enslaved people as mere merchandise to be bought and sold. His business thrived on cruelty and deception, and with every transaction, he sank deeper into a world where greed and violence were the only currencies that mattered. The partnership flourished, and with the profits, Aldrich bought Willowbrook Plantation, a modest cotton estate that marked his entry into the planter elite. But beneath the veneer of respectability, the foundations of his empire were already cracking. The very alliances that had propelled him to power would soon become his undoing. The desperation that bound Deveau and Rochelle to Aldrich was matched only by their fear of exposure. Federal marshals were closing in, investigating illegal slave trading operations along the Gulf Coast. Whispers of betrayal and suspicion began to circulate, and Aldrich's ruthless nature revealed itself in full. Rather than face ruin alongside his partners, he plotted to eliminate them, to seize their wealth and silence the only men who knew the full extent of his crimes. The cracks in Aldrich's empire were not just financial or legal, they were deeply personal. His ambition had blinded him to the dangers lurking within his own circle, and his moral bankruptcy had set in motion a chain of events that would lead to murder, betrayal, and ultimately, his own downfall. The man who had clawed his way from obscurity to power was about to discover that some debts could not be escaped, and some sins demanded a price far greater than money. The warehouse on the outskirts of New Orleans was cloaked in the thick, suffocating heat of a summer evening, the kind that pressed down on the skin and made every breath feel heavy and slow. Jeremiah Aldrich arrived early, his footsteps echoing hollowly against the cracked wooden floorboards as he entered the dim space that had served as the Delta Trading Company's nerve center for 3 years. The air was thick with the scent of oil, tobacco, and something darker and unspoken tension that clung to the shadows like a living thing. Aldrich's eyes flicked to the heavy oak table at the center of the room, where ledgers and shipping manifests lay scattered, their pages yellowed and stained. He moved with deliberate calm, setting down a bottle of whiskey and 3 glasses, the clink of glass against wood sharp in the silence. This was no ordinary meeting. Tonight, the fragile alliance between him and his partners, Marcus Deveau and Samuel Rochelle, would shatter forever. He had spent weeks weaving the perfect web of deceit. The plan was simple in its brutality. Eliminate the 2 men who knew too much, and make it appear as though their deaths were the tragic result of a bitter dispute gone horribly wrong. Aldrich's mind was a cold machine, calculating every detail with ruthless precision. He had even arranged for 3 dockworkers' men with no loyalty but a price to serve as false witnesses, ready to swear they had seen Deveau and Rochelle arguing violently earlier that day. The first to arrive was Marcus Deveau, his face drawn and pale beneath the flickering gaslight. He carried the weight of his family's crumbling plantation in his eyes, but there was a flicker of hope as he spotted Aldrich. "Jeremiah," he said cautiously, "I trust you've heard the news about the marshals. We need a plan fast." Before Aldrich could respond, the heavy door creaked open again, and Samuel Rochelle stepped inside. The former ship captain's weathered face was etched with lines of worry and fatigue, but his eyes burned with a steely resolve. "We can't afford mistakes," he said, voice low and steady. "If they find out about the shipments from Cuba, it's over for all of us." Aldrich nodded, masking the venom coiling beneath his calm exterior. "We'll handle it," he said smoothly. "But first, we need to settle the matter of the accounts. There's been talk of missing funds, and I want to clear the air before we move forward." The 3 men gathered around the table, the tension thickening with every passing moment. Aldrich poured whiskey into the glasses, the amber liquid catching the light like liquid fire. "To our partnership," he said, raising his glass. Deveau and Rochelle hesitated, then clinked their glasses together. As the whiskey burned down their throats, Aldrich's hand drifted toward the pistol concealed beneath his coat. His heart beat steadily, unshaken by the weight of what he was about to do. The moment was now or never. Without warning, Aldrich drew the pistol and fired. The sharp crack shattered the heavy silence, and Marcus Deveu's eyes widened in shock as he slumped forward, blood blossoming across his chest. Rochelle lunged instinctively, overturning the table between them and grabbing a broken whiskey bottle, slashing wildly at Aldrich's face. Pain exploded across his cheek, a deep gash that would leave a permanent scar, but Aldrich was prepared. The struggle that followed was brutal and desperate. Crates toppled, papers scattered, and the floor slicked with blood. Rochelle fought with the fury of a man who knew he was dying, but Aldrich's youth and cold calculation won out. With a final savage twist of the knife, hidden in his boot, he ended the fight. Breathing heavily, Aldrich stepped back and surveyed the carnage. The 2 men lay motionless, their blood mingling on the floorboards. But the work was far from over. He set to work meticulously staging the scene. Deveu's body was positioned to suggest he had been shot while reaching for a weapon. Rochelle's corpse was arranged with a bloody knife in hand and defensive wounds that told a story of a violent struggle. Money was scattered across the table, the office safe damaged to imply a robbery gone wrong. Aldrich even inflicted wounds on his own hands and arms, careful to make them look like defensive injuries. The false witnesses arrived on cue, their rehearsed testimonies painting a picture of a bitter dispute over missing funds that had spiraled fatally out of control. The police, eager to close the case and distracted by more pressing crimes, accepted Aldrich's story with minimal scrutiny. As the warehouse emptied and the night deepened, Aldrich stood alone amid the wreckage of his betrayal. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him, but he pushed it aside. He was the sole survivor, the man who had outwitted death and seized the spoils. Yet, in the shadows beyond the city, two young men, Philippe Deveau and Henry Rochelle, were beginning to piece together the truth. Unaware of the full extent of Aldrich's treachery, they carried the legacy of their father's lives and deaths. The seeds of vengeance had been sown, and the shadow hanging over their families was only just beginning to stretch its long, cold fingers toward them. The night whispered its secrets, and somewhere in the darkness, justice waited patiently. Philippe Deveau was just 22 when the news of his brother Marcus's violent death reached him. The weight of grief settled heavily on his shoulders, but beneath the sorrow burned a cold, unyielding fire. Unlike the older Deveau men, who had often been ruled by impulse and desperation, Philippe possessed a calculating mind sharpened by years of watching his family's slow decline. He understood that raw anger was a luxury he could not afford. Revenge, if it was to be justice, required patience, precision, and a plan that would leave no room for error. Across the city, Henry Rochelle, barely 24, was grappling with his own loss. His father, Samuel, had been a man of the sea-rough, pragmatic, and fiercely loyal. Henry inherited not only his father's maritime connections, but also a keen intellect and a formal education in law and finance. Where Philippe was the strategist, Henry was the tactician, adept at navigating the labyrinthine world of banking and commerce that Aldrich had so recklessly exploited. Together, they formed a silent alliance, bound by blood and a shared thirst for retribution. The two men met for the first time in a discreet French Quarter restaurant, their conversation hushed but charged with purpose. Philippe laid out the evidence he had painstakingly gathered. Inconsistencies in Aldrich's story, the staged crime scene, the paid witnesses. Henry brought financial records, tracing the flow of stolen money through banks and safe houses, revealing the true extent of Aldrich's theft. It was a revelation that transformed their grief into resolve. This was no mere business dispute. It was a calculated murder, a betrayal that demanded a response as ruthless and methodical as the crime itself. Over the next decade, Philippe and Henry wove a web of quiet vengeance. They infiltrated Aldrich's social circles, attending the same clubs and gatherings, learning his habits, his weaknesses. Philippe's charm and social grace allowed him to become a trusted acquaintance, while Henry's position within the banking world gave him unprecedented access to Aldrich's financial dealings. They discovered a man teetering on the edge of ruin, crippled by gambling debts and risky loans, his empire built on shaky foundations. Unlike Aldrich's impulsive brutality, the sudden murders, the violent struggles, Philippe and Henry's approach was patient and cold. They manipulated Aldrich's creditors, subtly tightening the noose around his finances. They arranged for him to be drawn into high-stakes gambling games where the odds were stacked against him, ensuring losses that drained his resources. Every loan renewal came with harsher terms. Every investment became a trap. Slowly, inexorably, Aldrich's world began to crumble. But their plan was not merely to bankrupt him. They sought to dismantle his identity, to strip away the respectability he had so carefully constructed. The forced marriage to Celeste, the enslaved cook whose hatred for Aldrich ran deep, was the final devastating stroke. It was a public humiliation designed to shatter the social order Aldrich had relied upon, to expose the rot beneath the polished surface. Philippe and Henry understood that true revenge was not swift or violent. It was a slow, deliberate unraveling, a psychological siege that would leave Aldrich isolated, broken, and utterly powerless. Their decade-long campaign was a testament to their resolve, a dark mirror to the impulsive cruelty that had destroyed their fathers. In the shadows, they waited, patient and unyielding, until the moment was right to strike the final blow. And when that moment came, it would be a reckoning unlike any the South had ever seen. Aldrich's empire, once a symbol of ruthless ambition and unchecked greed, began to crumble not with the roar of cannon fire, or the clash of swords, but with the quiet, relentless pressure of financial ruin. The slow drip of manipulated loans, mounting gambling debts, and the tightening grip of creditors was a siege that wore down his defenses day by day, hour by hour. It was a war waged not on battlefields, but in the shadowed corners of New Orleans banks, gambling dens, and drawing rooms places where power was measured in ledgers and whispered deals rather than muskets and bloodshed. Henry Rochelle, with his intimate knowledge of the city's financial arteries, orchestrated the first strikes. From his position within the First National Bank of New Orleans, he subtly influenced the terms of Aldrich's loans. Interest rates crept higher with each renewal. Payment schedules were arranged to coincide with the most vulnerable moments in the plantation cycle, and credit lines were quietly restricted. To the outside world, these were routine business decisions, but to Aldrich, they were the tightening noose around his neck. Every missed payment, every late fee, was a blow to his pride and his pocketbook. Simultaneously, Philippe Deveau exploited Aldrich's well-known gambling addiction. Through carefully placed bribes and discreet alliances with the city's most notorious gambling operators, he ensured that Aldrich was invited to increasingly high-stakes games. These were no ordinary poker nights. They were calculated traps where the other players, in silent collusion, allowed Aldrich to win small pots early on, luring him deeper into the game. As the stakes escalated, so did the losses, draining his remaining liquid assets and pushing him further into desperation. But financial ruin was only one facet of the campaign. The psychological warfare was equally devastating, and it was here that Celeste, the enslaved cook whose life had been intertwined with Aldrich's for years, became both victim and weapon. Beneath her calm exterior simmered a hatred as deep and dark as the bayous that surrounded Willowbrook Plantation. Purchased by Aldrich years earlier, torn from her family and forced into servitude, Celeste had endured years of silent suffering. Yet, unlike many who hid their pain behind masks of compliance, she had never concealed her contempt for the man who had destroyed her life. Celeste's role in Aldrich's downfall was subtle but devastating. She wielded her knowledge of his habits and vulnerabilities like a scalpel, cutting away at his strength with quiet precision. Meals were prepared with care, yet laced with ingredients that aggravated his chronic stomach ailments. Dishes were occasionally, accidentally, spoiled, favorite utensils broken, and rumors of financial trouble whispered among the other enslaved workers, all designed to sow seeds of paranoia and stress. Aldrich, increasingly isolated and desperate, found himself trapped in a nightmare where every comfort became a source of suspicion. His growing paranoia led him to prepare his own meals in secret, avoid drinking anything Celeste offered, and even sleep apart from her in a locked guest room. But these defensive measures only deepened the gulf between them, fueling the very isolation his enemies sought to impose. To the outside world, Aldrich's behavior appeared erratic and unstable. Neighbors whispered about his gaunt appearance, his nervous mannerisms, and the strange marriage that had upended the social order. Celeste played her part with masterful skill, presenting herself as the devoted wife caring for a husband beset by illness and stress. Her performances of worry and affection were so convincing that even trusted friends and the plantation's physician dismissed Aldrich's fears as symptoms of mental decline. This psychological torment was a slow, suffocating poison, as effective as the arsenic that would later course through his veins. Aldrich was not only losing his fortune, he was losing his mind, his dignity, and the very identity he had fought so hard to build. The man who had once commanded respect and fear was reduced to a shadow, haunted by the invisible forces closing in around him. Celeste's hatred was not born of cruelty, but of survival and justice. She was a living testament to the human cost of Aldrich's ambition, a weapon forged in the fires of loss and betrayal. Her subtle sabotage was a quiet rebellion, a reclaiming of power in a world designed to deny her any agency. And as Aldrich's world unraveled, it became clear that the slow destruction of his fortune was only the beginning of a far darker reckoning. The morning of the marriage dawned heavy and gray, the sky swollen with low-hanging clouds that seemed to press down on Willowbrook Plantation like a suffocating shroud. The air was thick with humidity, carrying the faint, unsettling scent of damp earth and decaying leaves from the nearby swamps. Inside the grand colonial mansion, the atmosphere was charged with a tension so palpable it seemed to seep into the very walls. Neighbors and acquaintances arrived in hushed groups, their faces etched with disbelief and thinly veiled curiosity. Whispers followed them like shadows, rumors of madness, desperation, and scandal that no one dared speak aloud, but everyone feared to ignore. Jeremiah Aldrich stood in the parlor, dressed in his finest clothes, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. His eyes darted nervously around the room, avoiding the stares of those who had once regarded him with respect. Across from him, Celeste appeared calm and composed, her simple yet elegant gown a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding her. At 38, she was a large woman, but there was a quiet dignity in the way she carried herself, a dignity that only deepened the grotesque nature of the union about to be solemnized. The minister, a man from a distant parish burdened by debts to local gambling houses, began the ceremony with a mechanical efficiency that betrayed no hint of the scandal unfolding before him. His voice echoed hollowly through the room as he recited the traditional vows, each word a cruel mockery of the forced bond being forged. The guests shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging furtive glances, others stiffening with silent judgment. The very idea of a white plantation owner marrying one of his own enslaved was an affront to every social norm, every unspoken rule that governed the antebellum South. Aldrich's voice trembled as he spoke his vows, barely audible beyond the first row of witnesses. His internal torment was a tempest raging beneath a fragile veneer of composure. He was a man stripped of power, forced to wear his humiliation like a second skin. The marriage was not a choice, born of love or faith, but a weapon wielded by those who sought to dismantle him, piece by piece. Each syllable he uttered was a surrender, a public admission of defeat that echoed far beyond the walls of Willowbrook. Celeste's responses, in stark contrast, were clear and unwavering. She promised to love, honor, and obey with a conviction that sent a chill through the room. Her voice carried the weight of years spent in silent suffering, of a hatred carefully concealed beneath layers of obedience. The ceremony, grotesque in its implications, was a spectacle of power inverted, a plantation owner legally bound to the very person he had once owned, a man reduced to a figure of public spectacle and private despair. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the room seemed to hold its breath. The final act, the kiss, was a moment suspended in time. Aldrich's face drained of color as he leaned forward, the weight of his fate pressing down with unbearable force. Celeste met his lips with a brief, calculated kiss, sealing the union that would become his slow undoing. Outside, the heavy clouds began to break, a faint drizzle misting the grounds as guests departed, their whispers trailing behind them like a gathering storm. The social shockwaves rippled through the parish, a scandal that would be spoken of in hushed tones for years to come. Aldrich was left alone in the mansion, the walls suddenly alien and oppressive, the marriage contract a noose tightening around his neck. This was no mere ceremony. It was a legal trap, a public shaming, and the opening act of a slow, methodical destruction. The poison had been administered, not in a vial or a blade, but in the binding of vows that would haunt Aldrich until his final breath. The dread that settled over Willowbrook that day was only the beginning, a dark prelude to the torment that awaited within the gilded cage of marriage. The days following the marriage unfolded like a slow descent into a waking nightmare for Jeremiah Aldrich. At first, the changes were subtle, an unplaceable bitterness in his morning coffee, a a faint metallic tang lingering on his tongue after meals. But as weeks passed, the symptoms grew more insistent. Persistent headaches that throbbed behind his eyes, waves of nausea that left him weak and trembling, and a creeping exhaustion that no amount of rest could dispel. His body betrayed him in ways that no doctor could explain, and the man who had once commanded respect now found himself a prisoner within his own home. Celeste moved through the mansion with a quiet authority that unsettled Aldrich more than any open confrontation ever could. She prepared his meals with the same practiced care she had always shown, but beneath the surface lay a calculated cruelty. Each dish was a carefully measured dose of poison, administered with the precision of a surgeon. Arsenic, slow-acting and insidious, coursed through his veins, eroding his health day by day. Yet to the casual observer, Celeste remained the devoted wife, tending to her husband's every need with patient concern. Aldrich's growing paranoia became a prison of its own making. He began to distrust everyone around him, convinced that poison lurked in every glass, every bite of food. He took to preparing his own meals in secret, selecting ingredients with trembling hands and hiding utensils in his study. He refused to drink anything Celeste offered, relying instead on water from a well only he could access. At night, he abandoned the marital bed, retreating to a locked guest room where he hoped to escape the invisible threat. But these precautions only deepened his isolation. Neighbors whispered about his gaunt appearance and erratic behavior, speculating that the stress of his unusual marriage had driven him to the brink of madness. Friends and acquaintances who once sought his company now kept their distance, unsure whether to pity or fear the man unraveling before them. Even Dr. Hamilton Warren, the plantation's longtime physician, found himself at a loss. His examinations revealed symptoms consistent with chronic poisoning, but without clear evidence, the diagnosis was dismissed as nervous exhaustion or mental decline. Celeste's performance was flawless. When guests expressed concern, she responded with the tender worry of a devoted wife, her eyes welling with tears as she spoke of Aldrich's fragile state. She prepared elaborate meals that he refused to eat, offered drinks he declined with obvious suspicion, and maintained the facade of a household struggling to cope with illness. Her subtle manipulations turned Aldrich's defensive actions into signs of paranoia, his mistrust into evidence of a mind slipping away. The psychological torment was relentless. Aldrich was trapped in a house where every comfort became a source of fear, every gesture of affection a potential threat. The woman he was legally bound to live with was the architect of his slow demise, wielding her knowledge and hatred like a weapon. His pleas for help were met with disbelief, his accusations dismissed as the ravings of a man broken by stress and humiliation. As the poison worked its cruel magic, Aldrich's world shrank to the confines of Willowbrook's walls. The plantation that had once symbolized his power became a prison. The marriage that was meant to secure his legacy, now the instrument of his destruction. In the silence of the night, haunted by pain and betrayal, he realized that his torment was far from over. The slow poison was not just in his body, it was in the very fabric of his existence, unraveling him piece by piece until nothing remained but a shadow of the man he once was. Jeremiah Aldrich's final moments were marked not by the violent end one might expect from a man so steeped in cruelty, but by a slow, agonizing surrender to the poison that had been his constant companion for months. On a humid June evening in 1854, as the heavy air pressed against the walls of Willowbrook Plantation, Aldrich collapsed in the grand dining room, clutching his chest and gasping for breath. The guests who had gathered for a somber dinner watched in stunned silence, mistaking his convulsions for the final throes of a man broken by stress and illness. Dr. Hamilton Warren, summoned in haste, did what he could, but the signs were unmistakable to those who knew the truth. Aldrich was dying, not from natural causes, but from a slow, deliberate poisoning. Yet, to the outside world, The official cause of death was recorded as natural causes associated with prolonged nervous exhaustion. The truth was buried beneath layers of deception, a secret known only to a few who had orchestrated his downfall with cold precision. The funeral was a muted affair, attended by neighbors who whispered of tragedy and misfortune, but dared not speak of the darker realities lurking beneath the surface. Celeste, playing the role of the grieving widow with chilling conviction, accepted condolences with a composed grace that belied the years of hatred and planning that had led to this moment. To the world, she was a woman who had lost her husband. To those who understood, she was the final instrument of justice in a long, patient reckoning. But the story of Willowbrook did not end with Aldrich's death. In a transformation as profound as it was symbolic, the plantation that had once been a bastion of oppression became a refuge for those seeking freedom. Under the stewardship of Philippe Deveau and Henry Rochelle, the estate was converted into a sanctuary for freed slaves and escaped bond people, a station on the Underground Railroad that offered hope and safety in a land still shackled by injustice. This metamorphosis was not merely practical, but deeply poetic. The very grounds where human lives had been bought and sold were now a place of liberation and resistance. The grand mansion that had hosted scenes of betrayal and despair became a beacon of hope, its walls echoing with the footsteps of those who dared to dream of freedom. The nature of justice in this tale defies the neat boundaries of law and order. In a society where the powerful often escaped accountability, where courts were complicit in maintaining oppression, justice was carved out in the shadows, patient, methodical, and unyielding. Revenge, in this context, was not a moment of violent retribution, but a slow, deliberate dismantling of a man's life and legacy, a punishment that matched the cruelty he had inflicted on others. Aldrich's story serves as a haunting reminder that justice can take many forms, and that sometimes it is the quiet, unseen forces that wield the greatest power. The legacy of Willowbrook Plantation stands as a testament to the resilience of those who refuse to be forgotten, and to the enduring truth that even in the darkest corners of history, the seeds of redemption and resistance can take root and flourish. In the shadowed corridors of history, where law often bends to the will of the powerful, the line between justice and revenge becomes blurred, sometimes indistinguishable. Jeremiah Aldrich's downfall was not delivered by courts or juries, but by those who took the law into their own hands, crafting a slow, deliberate reckoning that matched the cruelty he had inflicted. But this raises a profound question. When the systems meant to protect the innocent fail, does vengeance become a form of justice, or does it simply perpetuate the cycle of violence? Was the decade-long campaign against Aldrich a righteous act of retribution, a necessary correction in a world rife with corruption and impunity? Or was it a monstrous betrayal of morality, a cold and calculated punishment that mirrored the very darkness it sought to condemn? Can the slow poison of psychological torment ever be justified, even against a man whose hands were stained with blood and greed? And what of Celeste, the woman who transformed from victim to instrument of vengeance? Was her role an act of survival, a reclaiming of agency in a world designed to deny her power? Or did she become something more, a symbol of how pain and hatred can twist even the most human of souls into agents of destruction? These questions linger long after the story ends, inviting us to reflect on the nature of justice in societies where the law is often a tool of oppression. They challenge us to consider the cost of revenge, not just to the guilty, but to those who wield it, and to ask whether true justice can ever be achieved outside the bounds of mercy and forgiveness. What do you think? Was the slow-burning vengeance against Aldrich a necessary act of justice, or did it cross a line into something darker? Can justice exist in a corrupt society without becoming revenge? Share your thoughts below. Let's explore these difficult questions together. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the dark heart of history, where justice and revenge intertwine in ways both haunting and unforgettable. If this story stirred something in you, whether it was shock, curiosity, or a deeper reflection, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a tale that challenges what you think you know. There are countless secrets still buried in the shadows of history, waiting to be uncovered. What other mysteries lie hidden beneath the surface, just out of reach? Join us next time as we delve into another chilling story that will keep you questioning, wondering, and maybe even fearing what lurks in the past. Don't miss it.